right, let's talk about a video blog in the context of healing trauma. And I came up with video blogging as an antidote to a couple of cultural problems. The first one was that my therapists were primary in the abuse leading to PTSD, which somewhat, it creates so much anger and anticipation around other therapists that, to pay money to get mad at other therapists. And then, then there was also the fact that my routine was thrown off so much by the PTSD that I felt like my time schedule was being just rocked this way and that way with 30-foot waves. And while I'm rocking this way and that way with 30-foot waves, therapists want me to show up on time and at their location for a specific amount of time. So I'm swaying this way and that way. My sleep cycle is changing. How I'm feeling is going up and down. Whether I can drive safely is going up and down. What's going on at work? Am I able to talk? Can I get out of bed? All of this is just, swinging with these 30-foot waves. And the therapist, in a rather sociopathic expression of traumatic ignorance, is saying, well, why don't you call me at this number at this time to talk for this amount of time, and then pay me this amount of money and show up at my location at this time, independent of all that, and then just disappear after the 50 minutes or whatever is up, and then be off on your way. And if you get better, great. If you don't get better, I'll have another customer. But this whole thing just seemed incredibly disrespectful and stressful. And so that kind of said, no more therapists. Then there was the dynamic of, being in a shadow-averse culture, meaning the United States does not like to look at its shadow. It likes superficial, materialistic winners who are positive and put things in nice little sound bites. And it's a frenetic and addictive culture around keeping busy, around the most absurd things imaginable. I'd love to talk to you, but I've got to rush off and play tennis, and then I've got to do this, and so you try and track me down next week. And so this also felt incredibly dishonoring of the issue. And there were a few times I had, in-depth conversations with a few people, in the United States. And they basically said, that sounds pretty terrible. I've got to go. And that was the end of that. And this kind of left this message like, you're a burden and aren't really worth my time to do anything about. And this was the message of my abusers. You're a burden, and we're not going to do anything about our abuse. And so, this didn't feel healing. So, that we got another problem. Then there's the fact that, interruptions feel very disorienting when you're trying to land in this highly volatile emotional state and speak about something that's incredibly painful to feel. But when you're talking, you have to feel some of the things that, that you're talking about. And, if you're a man in a chauvinistic cult, which, where you're going to be shamed for having feelings, where you're going to hear the shame voices in your past, these voices, they're the mirror neuron representation of all the movies where you see guys being teased and beat up for being sensitive, for having feelings. They're all the times you talked about something and someone else made you feel small for it. They're all the times you talked about something and then people gossiped about you because you had feelings. They're the constant messages that the cool people don't have feelings. That's why they're cool. They're sociopathic. And so cold, sociopathic, warm, empathic, the cool people don't have feelings. Surprise, surprise. And you want to be cool? Well, everyone wants to be cool, i.e., everyone wants to pretend that they don't have feelings and get as far as possible from their own feminine side. So in all of that context, then there is a question, it's this big risk to push through all those judgments and make a connection and start talking. Now, in a culture like ours, you can somewhat schedule a getting together, and that's scheduled. But the I've got to go is not scheduled 90% of the time. And so there's this very difficult landing to come into one's body and talk about something. It's just hanging on by a few threads. And then someone says, I've got to go. And it's not, is this a good time for me to go? Are you going to be dissociated because I abruptly ended? Are you going to feel like I'm avoiding you and feel shamed because I left right at this vulnerable moment? There's none of that questioning, conversation, attunement, or even information like I'm going to be going at this time. Is that enough time for you to go into what you have to say? And if not, shall we schedule more time because you're obviously at your wit's end and I need to prioritize that over tennis or something else, which is one of the more sociopathic messages, because when you're at your wit's end, am I going to die? Am I going to be on the street? Am I going to be able to function at work? I don't know, and I need to talk this through. And someone else is like, oh my gosh, I could miss tennis for a week. Like the world's going to come to an end. It's like my life or tennis, my life or book club. And this is such a joke. The fact that as a cult, we cannot prioritize between these two things, shopping or suicide. What's the deal? This is such a joke, meaning the amount of cultural illiteracy, the amount of emotional and psychological illiteracy being displayed when you realize that the people you're dealing with have an operating system that lacks all frame of value. You realize it would be kind of like a computer that you said, count my money and make intelligent decisions. And the computer can't decide between a $1 bill and a $100 bill because it values them the same. You would get rid of that computer because it can't track value. You always prioritize a $100 bill over a $1 bill if you have to grab for one and they're both blowing through the wind. You always prioritize responding to a traumatic event over a little bit of discretionary fun if you're intelligent. But that's the thing. Our cult is not intelligent. And in many ways, in sitcoms, etc., it talks about the coolness of, let's not talk to them. They're too emotional. They're too moody. Let's just go and have a little fun. Watch some boring movie about, and sit and complain about it. And that's more important in our cult than, sitting there for 2 or 3 hours and actually learning something about, someone else in the world, about the traumatic state of our cult, about what it's going to be like to deal with this for your partner or friend or whatever. You're going to have someone in your life that goes through this because we're a cult that produces massive amounts of trauma. And And so it's in everyone's interest to take the time and really learn in advance, since you're not going to be taught in high school, since your parents aren't going to teach you, since your job is not going to teach you, and since your cult is going to plunge you into these waters. It's very good training to really learn what it's like by volunteering to help someone in that terrain. But instead, our sitcoms show the opposite, that the cool people would make up some little excuse and then go, try and have a one-night stand or something. And so, these are many, many, misguided signposts, first ignorance and all that, and then moving into, suggesting that cool people do the opposite of what intelligent people would do. And so this is all a problem. And so, the question is, how do you respond to that? I also realized that, despite being pretty widely read, reading a lot of biographies, really enjoying documentaries, I found it fascinating how little I had been exposed to trauma or sexual abuse. They don't come up in Netflix. They don't come up on YouTube. Trauma and sexual abuse just seems to just be a vacant area in media coverage. And so I thought, this is odd. And I said, if I'm feeling alone in all of this, and looking at Bessel van der Kolk's book and understanding the millions of people who are going through trauma and sexual abuse and PTSD, how are they feeling? How are they feeling being left to deal with this all on their own in a traumatically illiterate cult? And I thought they're probably feeling lonely, a bit crazy, angry, lots of pent-up feelings and not know how to express them. And something that people have told me is that I'm a great articulator. And so I thought, I'm being made to feel useless by a cult that does not know how to learn from me. Meaning this cult is desperately in need of becoming trauma literate. It's costing trillions of dollars in the economy to maintain chronically traumatized large percentages of people, and many of them with PTSD, and repair the damage and the loss in productivity. It's costing trillions of dollars. And this cult is too dumb to know that it's dumb to, in this area. So it's too dumb to use me. And because I'm not being asked for interviews about how people could help traumatized people, I know exactly what I need and what other people might benefit from as well, but I'm not being asked, and people are pretending that it's a burden for me to talk. Meanwhile, there's millions of isolated and lonely people who are not getting or in the same position and may or may not have the time and ability to make videos like this. So I decided that I would set a goal of transparently representing my life day by day through traumatic states. And priorities change around trauma. You realize that, having the right hairdo or whatever isn't really going to affect whether you're depressed that day or not. But whether your partner is willing to sing to you, or whether you have access to a quiet place without banging doors, could make a big deal. For example, I bought plastic rubber door stoppers that would go between the door jamb and these big wooden doors, so that some of my favorite hotels would not constantly jolt me out in the state of PTSD as people went in and out slamming these doors. This would drive me nuts. And so I would knock on their doors. You're making a lot of noise. Here, have a plastic thing. And suddenly, I mean, you'd think hotels would do this on their own, but, suddenly the doors were quiet because I had $5 worth of sticky things. And, I didn't feel like my life was falling apart because of $5 of foam stickies. And that's it. I mean, that's all it took to increase my well-being 30-40%, and and give a sense of agency and stuff. And some of the hotels said, thank you, we should have thought of this years ago. But I turned to blogging in part because I couldn't type. My hands were exhausted. I had kind of chronic fatigue from adrenal collapse over all this effort. I also, I thought it would be good to get it out of my system. And there's something about doing it for someone else that is motivational. Like writing in my diary didn't feel motivational. I'm just going to know how miserable I am and that I don't really know what's about it, and and no one else is going to know about it, and that's how my abusers want it. They want, to bury me because I'm an embarrassment of their therapeutic practices and all that. It's like, I don't like that. I don't like that. And it seems like too many victims of abuse are more worried about how their abusers feel about other people knowing the impact of the abuse than they are about their own well-being. So I didn't like that either, because that's consistent with the abusive message that you don't matter. The abuser matters. That's why you're abused. I mean, in the case of my therapist, it would have taken them 2 minutes to say, how are we impacting you? Why does that have that impact on you? What can we do to stop that impact? And how can we help you repair the impact? It's not complicated. It's not rocket science, except an abuser who has a commitment to an ulterior agenda that involves burying you to protect their feeling of looking good to themselves or others will never ask that, even if they're trained psychologists and therapists, because they don't want to know the answer to that, because then their agenda would be revealed. My therapist wanted to bury the whole story so that no one ever knew about it. Well, what would have helped me is if more people knew about it so that I could get more support and empathy at a really critical time. But that's at odds with my therapist's agenda. And so they can't ask the question because they can't confront the reality that they'd risk, a client's life rather than expose their careers, which is kind of, the opposite of what you go to therapists to sort out. And so I just started filming. Now at the beginning, it was hard to get out of bed, and so I just put a pillow on my chest and prop my phone, up on the pillow and just start talking. And there were times it was exhausting. There were times where it would bring up enormous grief and anger to go into what was happening and why. But it gave a sense of purpose. It gave a sense of agency. And part of my purpose was I don't want other people to go through this alone. I want them to know and have validation for what they're dealing with. That was one purpose. Another was I've protected my abusers, starting with my parents, for so long, trying to be positive, let go of the past and all this, that it felt good to break that cycle, which is kind of a message that I'm more important than the image of my abuser, as opposed to my abuser's image is more important than my life and well-being. That was an important message. Also, things get a little bit more coherent. I've always integrated by talking things through. the other thing is my therapists were very much in a minimizing mode. Whitewashing and minimizing impact is one of the ways abusers feel good about themselves. They whack you over the head with a baseball bat and then say, hey, how you doing? You feeling okay? You doing okay? And they want you to say yes. And so they, great, and off they go. If your head is swollen and, your eyes are this, and here's my bills, and then here it is again, and you kind of blog about it, it becomes harder to gloss over. And the other thing is, our cult doesn't provide a basis for someone who's been traumatized or abused to say things once to 100 people in their life. But every time you have to go into it, it's painful. And I realized that, since my abusers were in a wear me out mode, meaning they were doing various things so that it always took me more energy to get help or acknowledgement from them than the help that they gave. So I'd spend two units of energy criticizing them and saying, hey, this is not right and this isn't right. And I'd spend 2 units of energy, and then they would kind of ignore it. And then I'd spend 3 units of energy, and then they'd give me 1 unit of energy back. So I'm out 2 units of energy. And this is how you wear someone down. This is classic defense. You've got to repeat yourself 3 times because I'm going to forget. And then I'm going to forget again. And then I'm going to forget that I forgot. And it's like, oh gosh, I forgot? And then I'm going to forget that I forgot. And then I'm going to make you explain to me that I forgot that I forgot. This thing that's basic common sense, and when it gets more and more of a joke when your abuser is a therapist, because their whole point is, and shtick is, they're supposed to know communication, and good and all this stuff. And so you watch them being worse. My therapists were worse than about 50% of my relationship partners by a big margin. And none of my relationship partners had charged me to abuse me. And so this is a stunningly, just crazy statistic. And so making a video one time meant that I didn't have to decide between exhaustion and repeating myself or being invisible. I could say things once and then I could move on. And then if someone said, oh, something went wrong? What went wrong? Here's the video. Go watch it. Because I don't want to go through this 100 times for 100 people, because my abuser is not telling anyone, and so this client may want to know, or this client may want to know, or the courts may want to know, or, the relative of the abuser, or the friend that's a mutual friend may, I don't want to go through it 5, 10, 20 times, or feel like I have to live within the denial paradox of my abuser's denial. So nothing happened, or if it did, it wasn't a big deal, and that's what happened. And I can either live with that or exhaust myself. So this kind of broke that pattern, which was really important, because that nearly broke me, the thought that I'd have to live invisible for the rest of my life or endlessly repeat this with people that didn't want to know. And so that's kind of was the problems I wanted to solve, and blogging did all of it. It provided a record. It meant I didn't have to repeat myself. It meant that I could be a companion for other people going through similar terrain. It meant that I could get my head straight through talking through things. It meant that I could avoid the enraging, indignity of having to pay another therapist to fix the problem of an abusive therapist who I'd hired to fill in for other therapists who weren't abusive but weren't competent. Because I had complex PTSD, didn't know it, and my other therapist didn't know it. And so they didn't heal it, which is why I then tried psychedelics in order to kind of go into a deeper level, then was sexually abused on psychedelics, and then was abused and kind of pushed out of my community by a group of my therapists who wanted to protect each other. And so the idea of, calling in yet, another therapist who probably didn't know what they were doing to fix all that, and then feeling like a shit if I showed up late because I was dissociative and having to apologize, I'm so sorry I have symptoms of the trauma that, none of you other guys have healed. So could you please, charge me for the session I only had half of, or couldn't make it today, so of course we can't have the therapist inconvenienced. This just seemed like a complete joke. And so the other, value of blogging was that I found that when I opened my mouth and got in touch with something, there were times it was 3 hours before I clicked, pause in the video. In other words, I didn't know when I began talking. Do I need to talk for 10 minutes, an hour, 3 hours, 4 hours? I didn't know. I've made a 6-hour recording nonstop as just, one example. Now, the therapist, of course, would have me chop this up for their convenience. You've got 6 hours of thing that want to bubble up, but time's up. So just hold the place here, drive back to my house, and continue what you'd like to continue right now and what you're in the zone for, because that's convenient for me. The camera is not so rude. The camera just keeps recording, particularly phone cameras. I'm using a front-facing. This is actually a Zenfone 6. What I like about it is it shoots 4K and 1080p at 60 frames per second in the front and the rear, because the rear camera flips around the front. It's also got a 5,000 milliamp battery, so long battery life. Front-facing thing. Now, this front-facing thing is really important too, because the real challenge around trauma is to integrate and become aware of what's going on and end the craziness. The abuse dynamic is crazy making, and you want to do something that's integrating and sane. And this culture doesn't offer it. So when I'm looking at the phone, I'm seeing a man in front of me with facial expression, with gestures, with tone of voice. I'm seeing a person in trauma talking about things. And it's providing the perspective to look a little bit from the outside. If I just look at myself talking to myself and I'm not looking out in any way and I'm not imagining an audience, it's too insular. There's not enough focus. My thoughts wander. Why? Because I'm not trying to be coherent for someone else. And that, thoughts wander a lot in a traumatized state. What about this and what about this? And you don't have to finish sentences if you're just talking to yourself, etc. But if you're talking to a camera, imagining an audience, I'm getting the experience of, what's it like to be that guy? How's he feeling? What's his face telling me? What's his voice telling me? What's going on? What do I learn from what he's saying? Gee, that sounds pretty tough. Wow, I get that. And so there's a sense of a duality between the one who's letting this stuff bubble out and the one who's listening to it and watching that person speak. And that was very grounding, because there have been many times where I can talk lucidly for hours and then the video's off and I'm mumbling again because I'm not, I'm jumbled around inside and I'm not fully conscious of am I thinking it, or am I talking it, or my thoughts are distraction. It's not for someone else. And when you're in a lot of pain, you want to be dissociative because the more embodied you are, the more painful it is. And so I didn't really want to be fully in my body. So it felt like it had to have a purpose that was bigger to be worth the effort and worth the pain. It needed a bigger purpose. So that all worked. I have well over 1,000 hours of trauma blogging related, etc., up on YouTube. I feel like it has contributed to my sanity, contributed to my sense of empowerment. It has allowed me to empathize. There have been many times where I've finished a video and then I've cried because I saw what that guy went through. It's like, wow. Or I've cried for our culture because I understand that my abuse is small, compared to so many hundreds of thousands of people, that there are 6-year-old boys who've experienced, 10 times more abuse than I've experienced in 40 years. And they don't own a company. And they don't have a camera to talk to. And they've got a drunken, sociopathic mom or whatever that is going to hit them if they start telling the truth. How are they going to get through that life if it's this hard for me? How's it going to be for them? And so, but that sinks in with dialogue. The more people who talk, this has come up with the Me Too movement. The more people who talk, the more it's like, oh, I wasn't alone. I'm not alone. Other people understand. That takes the burden of loneliness, because there are many layers to the abuse of trauma in our culture. The first abuse is trauma illiteracy, so other people are going to traumatize you because they're trauma illiterate. They don't know any better. 1. 2, you're not going to know how to handle it because you're trauma illiterate. That's the second abuse. 3rd, no one's going to repair it because they're trauma illiterate. That's the 3rd abuse. The 4th abuse is you will likely be punished, stigmatized, ostracized, shamed, misunderstood, have the thing diminished, the whole 9 yards, rather than empathized and validated for the symptoms that you present. So then you're going to be punished again for the symptoms of trauma. Then, when you feel depressed and confused and this isn't unfair, nobody's going to understand that, the 5th wave of abuse. Then your abuser, particularly if you try and confront them, is likely going to try and undermine you and minimize it, etc., so that they feel good. That's the 6th abuse. Maybe your friends divide between the abuser and you. That's the 7th abuse. Some people don't believe necessarily what happens. That's the 8th, abuse. You start getting depressed about all these different layers of abuse and are told to get over it. That's the 9th abuse. And if you finally get yourself to a trauma therapist, they very well may traumatize you again through the shame of being so poorly presented. Many of us, we watch TV and stuff, and we know what the cool, good people look like. So just dragging ourselves on time or otherwise to a therapist in an uncool state, according to mass media, can feel like a shaming event. And then to have someone sit back and take notes for a large fee can be humiliating. And if we don't get better, we don't get a refund and understanding about that. And so, it's just a complete meltdown at the end of all that. And so having other people understand what that's like. I'm not crazy. I'm not alone. It's not my fault. Other people are part of this $1 trillion tax on the economy and this 40% tax in national well-being, because the tax is huge. Being around someone with PTSD can lower the well-being 50% for everyone around, and then can lower the well-being of the person in PTSD hundreds of percent. And you have things like, I wonder if they're having a good day or not. Are they going to take to drink? Is so-and-so not going to go to college because so-and-so can't work because they have PTSD? All this stuff is just huge. And we're so dumb as a cult that we don't even calculate this. We don't even have a national census. It's free. we could send out an email to every citizen in the United States every week. How many people do you have trauma of this and this and this? How many people in your life do? What are your needs, and how can we help as a national media, as this and that, to educate and support the people around you, etc., so that this clears up in a generation? But that would be too smart. And so how are you going to deal with that? Well, I think it begins by telling the truth. And so what I encourage you to do is to start with your phone, with a front-facing thing. Put it on a windowsill. Ideally, get a little phone stand, where it's facing you. Make it for yourself to begin with. Or if that feels too claustrophobic, create a YouTube channel, My Trauma Diary. You can make all the videos private initially or for all time, but put it out there and share it with people, that you trust. Now, this isn't necessarily a good idea. I shared it with a friend, for example, one of the few friends. He didn't get around to watching the video for 6 months. It's like, how much can we slap you in the face with the message, you are such a low priority that I can't even learn what's going on with you, let alone do anything about it for 6 months. Well, we're great at that in this cult, and then the audacity of friends for getting upset that we're upset about that is just one more, par for the course in the now 10 stacked layers of abuse. It's insane. It's dumb. It's crazy, and it's not your fault. And so, as soon as we can give these absurdities back to the cult that tries to dump them on the most vulnerable people in it, we have a little chance. At least we feel a little better, and we can, understand. That's my goal in criticizing the cult, is that you feel better about yourself, that you stop heaping all the shame that this cult has dumped on you, and start saying, yeah, that is pretty dumb that almost every high school kid in this country is traumatized, but we don't teach trauma literacy in high school. Pretty dumb, eh? It's pretty much of a torture cell. It is pretty dumb that we don't require parents to learn this. Why not? We ask them to get a driver's license. Are infants less fragile than cars? Why do you need to study a simple car more than an infant? But, oh no, you're drunk, you've had intergenerational abuse, your father had incest, his grandfather had incest. Go ahead and have an innocent child. Whatever you do behind closed doors, please don't tell us about. Fine with us. We're a shadow-averse cult. So that's the thought around the blog, and give it a go. Give it a shot. Make an hour. Make 45 minutes. See what comes out. See how you feel. Practice it. Sometimes, the first time's a little nervous, then you calm down. Of course, you get better at anything with practice. But at some point, as you develop a sense of mastery and competence, perhaps, it can even be fun to a certain extent, to realize that we're providing a national service, a cultural service, that all cults resist change, that all cults require truth-telling to challenge the status quo, and that's what any form of media is. So good luck, and I hope you give it a shot.